Hey, welcome back to Linode. My name is Austin Gill, and in this video series, we are building full stack applications with Remix, Prisma, and SQL databases. If you have not watched the previous videos, that's where we cover some of the technology decisions and then actually getting Remix and Prisma and the SQL databases hooked up and connected. So in this video, we're going to move on to the first part of the CRUD operations. That's going to be create. So we've made some edits to the homepage and we've got our database connection working and we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. Our app is just about done and we can ship it, right? There's just one problem. If I lived in a neighborhood where there were no pets, it would be done. But I live in a neighborhood with many pets and I need the ability to actually add these pets to the database. So we're gonna look at that next in the create section of this project. So getting back into our code, we know that we want to create a new route at /create. And again, because we're using file system-based routing, we can do that in Remix in a number of ways. We can create a new file called create.jsx, and that will handle the create route. Or we can create a folder called create, inside of which we can put an index.jsx file. And for the sake of this conversation, they'll both work pretty much the same. It gets slightly different when we start talking about nested routes, but we won't cover that today. So for this page, I'm just going to use a create file, and let's export a default component so we can just make sure that it's working. Now, if we go back to our application, we can go to /create, and we can see that we get our application background, and we get our little paragraph with the text create. So we know it's working. Now, there's a reason why we set up that default layout, because we want that layout to work on every page. So let's actually use it. Default layout. We're going to give the title of create. And get rid of that. And we actually have to import that default layout. So okay, looking good so far. As I mentioned before, we are going to need a form anytime that we actually have to capture data to send to the database. So we'll start with an HTML form. Now we need to decide what data we're going to actually capture. And if we look at our schema, we have ID, name, type, birthday, created at, and updated at. But the ID is going to have a default value, which should be auto-generated, so we don't need to capture that. The created at is going to have a default value, which is set to the current time when the entity is created. And updated at will also automatically be updated anytime it's created or updated. So we really only need 3 fields, name and type, and the birthday is again flagged as an optional property. So I'm going to start with an input, but I also have some fancy input components and a button component that I'm going to bring in from our pre-built components. So /components index.js, and we'll start with the name. So we'll do input, and I'll make this a self-closing tag. And every input needs a name, and this one will be name. Every input also needs a label, and in this case, we can just pass that in as a prop, which we'll set to capitalized name. Every input should also have an ID for accessibility reasons, which I won't go into right now, but you can take a look at the source code. That's going to be name. And then this input, because we said the name was a required property, I'm going to give it the required HTML5 validation attribute. Now we'll do kind of the same for the type. I'm going to do boop, 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 type. Label, we'll capitalize it. The type is going to be, the type is going to be slightly different because it's going to be pulled in from a list of options. So I actually can pass this as a type of select. That's the type of input that I want this to be. This is a fancy component, remember. And every select should support a list of options. So that is going to accept an array. I'm going to put an empty value at first so that we have an empty option that can be selected. And then I'm going to create a list. I'm going to have dogs, we're going to have cats, we're going to have birds, we're going to have reptiles. I don't know, maybe someone shows up at the park carrying their fish in a fish bowl, and had someone on my live stream a while back that had a bunny, so we'll do that as well. And then for everyone else, we'll just have another property called other. Okay, let's look at our form so far. Great, we have name, we have type, that's awesome. Unfortunately, this is how I want to store all of my type properties in the database with all lowercase, but that's not really great for the UI, so I'm actually going to modify that a bit. I'm going to pull these out and pull those into a separate array. I'm going to say type options. Up here, we're going to say const type options is equal to types dot map. So I need an array for types. Types equals the array that we listed before. And I'm going to map over each item. So we'll get the type. So the question here is, what do we actually return? Now, if we look at our options, the options can actually be a number of things. So it can be a string or this HTML attributes with this label and value. So that's actually what the object that I'm going to build. So we can say we're going to return an object that's going to have a label and a value. Now the value is easy. The value is going to match what we want it to be represented as in the database. So we'll just put the type in there. And the label is a little bit different. We basically just need to get the first letter in this each word and capitalize it, and then get the rest of the word. So we're going to say type dot char at, get the first one, and we'll say dot to uppercase. That will capitalize the first letter, and then we need to append it to the rest of the string. So we'll say type dot slice, and we'll go from the first index, and that should get us the full word with the first letter capitalized. Now, because we're passing in this type options in here, we should have the first option be just an empty string, and then these objects with the label and the value. So if we look and we go down there, cool, we see that. We can explore this element. We can see it's a select with a label, very nice. And each option has its own label and the value in there. Perfect. Okay, now moving on to the last input, where we're going to have an input, again, self-closing. And this one is going to be a type, or no, the name is going to be birthday. The label, I'm sure you can guess, capital birthday. The ID, once again, no surprise, birthday. And because it is a birthday, we're going to give it a type equal to birthday. No, I'm just kidding. That's not a real type. We give it a type equal to date. Now we also need to submit this form. So we're going to have the button component, and we're going to give it some text that says add a pet. Cool. Let's look at our form. Looking good, has everything we need. We've got name, we've got type. If we try to submit it, oh, did I forget the required attributes? Type required. I know the problem. Forgot that the button component is the default type of button. So we're going to move this type to submit. Now it's a submit button. Great. And if we try to submit, we'll get this little HTML5 validation, which is handy for the time being. Doesn't look great though, so I'm gonna give it a couple of styles. The elements are a little bit squished together. I'm gonna give it some breathing room, and we could do that with some padding on each input, but I think what I'm gonna do is give this form a class name of grid, and also give it some gap of 4. That's gonna turn that's gonna turn this form into a 1-column grid and put some gap in between each element. Only downside is now the button takes up the full screen. Don't really love that design decision, so I'm going to wrap that in a div and move that onto its own line. Cool. Okay, so now we've got a form on our page where we can capture the details of the pet, but what do we actually do with that data? If we go and fill it out, we can say Nugget is a type of dog, and we can forget the birthday for now and just submit that form. And what happens by default is the browser will reload the page and append the values and the names to the query string parameters. That's because in our form, the default behavior of an HTML form is to submit that form and all of the inputs via their name property, along with their values, using a GET request. So we can change that because we probably don't want to do a GET request. We want to do a sort of HTTP request that is going to mutate data or create data. So it's a lot better in this case and safer to use a post method. So we're going to set the method to post. Now, if we go back, let's go back to the empty page, and we can submit the same data. Nugget is a type of dog, and we can add the pet, and we'll see that we get a 405, and that makes sense because when the request is sent to this route, the browser is going to tell us that the method is not allowed. So what is going on here? Well, the interesting thing about Remix routes is that it treats each route as its own API as well. When we want to get data or do a GET request, it's going to return that route as HTML. But for post requests, we want to treat this route as an API as well, and which means we need to add the logic to respond to a post request. And how do we do that? And this is where we come into another Remix convention where, similar to the loader, we have to define the route's action where it's going to receive post requests. So back in our component, once again, similar to how we had defined the action or the loader on the home page, we're going to use another convention in Remix where we export a named function, export function, and the name of the function has to be action. And when we do this, we can do something like just prove that we're receiving the logic. So we're going to say we in here. And I think by convention, we have to return something. So we're going to return just a null value. So now if we go back and reload our create page, we're doing the GET request to the create page. We don't need to fetch any data, so we don't need a loader. But now if we add Nugget as a dog and we add the pet, we make that post request, the page refreshes because that's the default behavior of HTML forms. And we can see that that request was made as a post method. We can even see the payload has the name Nugget, the type of dog, and the birthday is an empty string technically. Now, if we look at our terminal, we can see that the post rest method was sent and we ran our logic. I must have sent it twice by accident, but yeah, we ran our logic in that action. So we've proved that we can receive the data here, but now we actually have to pull the data from the request. Now, if you've built any forms in recent years with JavaScript-centric applications, then you may be familiar with the pattern where we intercept a form submission with JavaScript and prevent the default behavior, grab the data out of that form and convert it to JSON, maybe send that JSON to an API endpoint using fetch. That way we kind of provide a better experience so the browser doesn't actually have to go through that whole reload. Currently on our application, we are experiencing that full page reload to do that post request because we're using an HTML form. But Remix really focuses on this idea of progressive enhancement, where we build a product that will work using the minimum viable sort of experience using just HTML. And then we use something like JavaScript to progressively enhance the application so that way, if something were to fail with JavaScript's loading, or a script that failed to download, or the user has a bad connection, or the browser has an extension that blocks JavaScript, or the rare case that the user has JavaScript turned off, then our application will still work with or without JavaScript enabled. So we can do that, and we actually have it working right now without JavaScript because we're using this HTML form. Unfortunately, that's also not the ideal behavior, because now we're sacrificing user experience of a modern, snappy app that doesn't have to do the whole page refresh. So the best solution is to satisfy both. And fortunately, the Remix team provides us with some tools to do that. So we can actually import a component from Remix React. So we're going to import form from, can I just say React? Remix, yeah. There we go. So we're going to import this form component, and this form component is pretty cool because it's literally, well, maybe not literally, but almost exactly a drop-in replacement for the HTML form. And it still takes the same methods and all of the other attributes, and it's going to output its own form element as well. You can see it right there. There it is. And it has all of the things, basically all the same things that we've defined. It explicitly adds the enc type and the action. Now, if we didn't define those, those would be set to these default values anyway. But here's something that's interesting that happens when we actually submit the form. Do nugget and dog. We're going to add the pet, and you'll see that nothing really changed on the page. And the reason being that we're using JavaScript to intercept that page request. But if we submit the form, we can see that that new request is being added to the page in the same way that we would if we had used JavaScript to prevent the default behavior, which stops the page from doing that refresh, and we use a fetch request to send that data. So it looks very much like the same request that we did a moment ago with just HTML forms, but this is going to be a little bit of a nicer user experience because we're not going to rely on that page refresh. Now, the next step is to take that data and actually do something with it. Okay, so we've got the form submitting in a nice user experience way, and we've got the data being sent, or the request being handled in this action function. So let's actually grab the data. So this action function Remix server is going to provide us with some arguments in there. So we can get an object with a property of not request, and this request object is actually going to have the form data on it. So we can say const form data is going to equal request.form data. Now that's going to be a method that returns a form data object. Well, technically it actually returns a promise that resolves to a form data object. So because we're dealing with promises, once again, I'm going to use this async await keyword, await. And then we can actually see what we've got here. So why don't we do something like create an object out of it, right? So console.log, and we'll say object.from entries. And because we're dealing with a form data object, we can actually grab the entries off of that. So now let's submit that form and see what we've got. We've got nugget, we've got type of dog, we add the pet, and we can see that form data is being sent. We've got the name of nugget, the type of dog, and the birthday is an empty string. Awesome. Okay, so now that we've got the data that we're more or less going to want, I'm going to go ahead and call that, or assign that to a variable called body, and we'll capture that. And then we have to actually do something with that body data. Now, you'll notice that when that body was sent, we have some data that looks more or less good, but we have this birthday that's an empty string. So we may want to actually deal with that and make sure that we have some valid data. If that string is empty, we can just forget about it, or something like that. So in my case, I think this is a good time to talk about validation. because if we reload this page and we try and submit this data, we have some client-side validation that's going to say, hey, we need this field, this is a required field, and then it'll say this one's a required field. But if someone were even just a little bit savvy, they could come in and maybe modify the HTML and get past those validations, right? So now we got into the select, they could go here, they could get rid of that, and then all of a sudden our validation logic is gone. And if we add this pet, that request is going to go through. It's going to send the payload completely empty. We're going to get the payload on the back end, and we have some invalid data. So we want to make sure that any data that we're accepting, we validate on the client side to make it convenient to let people know, what they need to do, but then also on the server side so that we actually get real data. So in my project, I like to use a validation library called Zod. So I'm going to import Z from Zod, and then we can actually define a pet schema for this validation logic. I'm going to export this one as well in case I need it somewhere else. I'm going to say export const pet schema is going to equal z.object. So we're going to define the shape of the object that we're expecting. We're going to say that we're expecting an object with a name property, which should be a string, and we're going to say, we're going to say that we have a minimum requirement of 1 character because it's required. And then we're going to say the type is going to be a z.enum, and we're going to say that this has to be one of the one of the types that we've defined above. So pretty good foresight that I used an array separated for this pet types and the type options. And then we're going to have a birthday. Birthday is going to be a z.date, and it's going to be optional. Now we have something that's kind of interesting here because I don't think I'm going to go too far into this. I'm just going to show you how it works. But Zod, we may want to actually do some pre-processing on this to do some coercion to say if we're going to get a type that is going to be a string, that's what we're expecting in, then let's actually see how this works. Let's get it hooked up before I spoil the surprise. So we're going to say it needs to be a type of date, and because it's the only optional field, we're going to mark it as optional. Okay, so that is our schema. Let's go down and actually use it. We're going to say when we get that body request, we're going to pass it through this schema. So we're going to say pet schema dot safe parse, and we're going to pass the body through that. And then we're going to say like something like const validation. Well, I know what it'll look like. So I'm going to say const, and we're going to destructure the results of this. Did I spell it right? There you go. We're going to destructure the results of this function or method, and it's going to have a few things on it. We're going to have an error, we're going to have success, and we're going to have the data that is the valid data if it is valid. So let's see what we've got with all that. We're going to console log error, success, and data. Cool. Let's go back to our form. Let's try submitting it with some good data. Nugget. I'm going to do dog. We're going to submit that. And let's see what we get. We get an error, expected date received string. And that's interesting because, well, we sent an empty string, right? So what if we send a more valid string? We'll get today's date and we'll add that pet. So now we should definitely have some valid data, right? And once again, we say, oh shoot, we expected the date, and once again, we received a string. And that makes sense because the query string parameters that we actually send on this request, or not the query string, but the body that we send on the request is actually being sent as a string. So we need to actually convert it to a date. Now we could do that in here, but I think Zod actually has this cool built-in feature where you can do Zod pre-process. And what that takes is a function that's going to take the value that comes in, and let's see, we're going to do some logic on that. And let's see, we're going to say if the value is return. If the value is defined, then we want to change that to a new date on that value. Otherwise, we'll just set it to undefined. And that's actually if it's truthy. So even if we pass the empty string, we'll convert it from empty string to undefined. Okay, that is that function. And then we'll set the actual type to be zdate optional. And then we'll close that off. So where am I on here? I think that needs to go like that. That looks right. No, that looks wrong. Okay, let's try this one more time. We're going to say nugget, type of dog. We're going to put in a date so it's actually defined and add the pet. And if we look here, we get, cool, undefined, true, and we get the object, including the birthday, as a date object. And if we do the same and get rid of everything and we add the pet, now we get undefined true, and then we get an object with the birthday being undefined, and that's quite all right. So what are those first two values? We had error, we had success, and we had data. So now let's see if we can actually send something that has an error. So I'm going to try and send this with an empty name, and we'll add the pet. That should have gone through. And here we get, cool, a Zod error because the code is too small. It says string must contain at least one character, and then we see false and undefined. So the first property there is that Zod error. The second is a Boolean, whether it was successful or not. And the third is the processed data after it's been ran through that schema. So with all that, we can actually say if there is not success, we'll do a to-do in here, to-do handle error. And maybe we can return early. Otherwise, we know that we're good with the data, and we can say add pet to database. Okay, so we're successfully receiving the data from the form. We are validating to making sure the data is good. Now we have to insert those values into the database. And the way that would look in SQL is something like this. Insert into, and then we would pass in the table name, and then we would pass in a list of columns. So like column 1, column 2, column 3. And then we would say, we would define a list of values, and we would pass in the values. Value 1 that corresponds with column 1, value 2 corresponding with column 2, and value 3 corresponding with column 3, etc., etc. Now again, we're not going to be writing SQL from scratch. We are going to be using Prisma to do that ORM goodness for us. So let's bring that in. Let's import the database from .. and where is it? The services / index.js. Cool. We'll grab that database and we'll run our insert command here. And once again, because we're working with the database, we can do this little dot syntax and see exactly what we want. Of course, not too hard to remember either. I'm going to do pet. And here we want to add a new entry into our database so we can see that the create method is available. Now, when we pass in the create method, we're also going to get some suggestions using IntelliSense that tells us what the arguments look like. And it's a whole bunch of data there that's kind of hard to read, but I can see that it's an object. So we can pass in an object. And then if I control space, I can see what it's going to auto suggest for me. So I can see that we've got a select, which is optional, or the data, which is required. So I'm going to insert some data. And data, we can also do some exploring to see what it expects. And look at that, it expects all of the properties that are available and defined in our database or our schema model. So we've got name, type, optional birthday, optional created at, ID, and updated at. So conveniently, this data actually matches the data that we have here. So instead of explicitly adding each one, I'm actually just going to drop that in there. And at this point, we've created a promise that's going to execute that. Of course, we have to kick that promise off, so we're going to await it. And we could get the data back. We could say const new pet equals await database create, and then this would be the value that we get back. It should be a pet object, pet any, maybe not. But the question that we have here is, what do we want to do after we've actually inserted a pet to the database? And I think I don't actually need this pet. What I want to do is, once I've filled out this form, I want to go back to the homepage because I want to see that list of pets. So instead of doing anything, I'm just going to wait for that to successfully be created. And then I want to redirect back home so I can see the list of pets. And in order to do a redirect, we have to return an object that expresses the headers and tells the browser, hey, let's redirect back to this page. But we aren't going to do that by hand because we can actually import some more helpers from Remix. So we're going to import redirect, and it should tell me, I think there, redirect from Remix node, because I'm using a node-based environment, and I'm going to return this redirect function, and I'm going to pass it the route that I want to redirect to. And all this is going to return is an HTTP response object that has the headers included that will dictate to the browser where I want to redirect to. And on the client side, the JavaScript that submits this form is actually going to read that redirect and handle the redirection for us, all with client-side routing, so we don't get that page refresh. So let's see what this final process looks like. I'm going to add Nugget. We're going to add the pet. The request is going to go off. We're going to see that request was sent. It sent our data, and then we get this other question about the routes, and that sends us back to the home page where we see our dog Nugget. Really, really awesome. So we've effectively created a dog, done some validation, inserted it into the database, and redirected back home. And we're just about done here because although the create operation works and validates our data and redirects us back home, we're just missing one thing, and that is, how do I actually get to the create page? I mean, before I would type it into the URL, but there's a good chance that people using this application may not even know it exists. So I think it would be a good idea. That's probably one of the main functionalities or the main pages I want on this app. So I'm going to throw a link up in the header here to navigate to that page. So back in our project, we can close the create page because I think that that's finished for now. We can open up this default layout where we have defined this header. And inside of the header, we have this nav link that links us to the neighborhood pet manager. Great. Well, I'm going to do a very similar one. And I'm going to add a link to that create route. I don't need this span. Don't need the title. And now I have this create SVG icon. Now these SVG components are kind of cool because they will tell me which SVGs are available. So I want to use this plus icon, and they also have a cool little built-in property called label. So I can give it some text label like add a new pet. And if we go to our site, we can see that that icon is up there now. And if I check it out, you can see that it's pretty handy even for screen reader users, that there's the link, and then in here we have this visually hidden text that says add a new pet, and then the ARIA hidden SVG. So that should come out pretty cool. If we check out the accessibility properties, we'll see that we are inside of a navigation and we have a link with the text add a new pet. Now I'm just going to do a few little stylistic changes here to make it look a little bit nicer. I'm going to throw that onto a new line. Throw that down, and we are going to give this a class name equal to rounded full. I'm going to give it some padding. I'm going to make it text white. I think it actually should already be text white. So we can do background primary. And let's see what we've got with that. Cool, nice little red button. It's a little bit big for my taste. So I'm gonna bump the font size down to XL3, and that's looking really good. So now if we come here, we can see if we click there, that takes us to the create page. If we click back, that takes us to the home page. And something that I really want to point out here is, once again, Remix is handling that server-side rendering. When we reload this, we can see that in the actual response from the server, we get all the information about that page, including pets, title, and nugget being in there. And if we navigate to a new page using this nav link component or the link component provided by Remix React, and if we click on this create route, we can see that the browser doesn't actually refresh as I'm navigating between these. Remix is handling the client-side navigation. But then again, if I reload here and I look at the source that's sent from the server, we would see that create page. So we can see that the H1 has that create tag right there. Close that. Okay, got it. Go away. Yeah, we can see the H1 with the create tag. Excellent. And we can zoom back out. It's cool because we get that server-side rendering and client-side rendering without having to really do a whole lot. So we get the best of both worlds. Great for SEO, great for performance, and great for user experience. So now that we've looked at some of that routing stuff, I actually want to add a little cancel button to this create page. So if we look at adding a new one, we should have a little cancel button down here where we can say, oh, do we want to create a new one? No, we want to cancel. Cool, let's just go back. And this is actually going to be quite simple because from this React library, we have access to a link component where we can actually say something like link is going to go to just the home page, and we're going to call that cancel. And if we look at that, we got our cancel button there. We can cancel that, takes us back to the home page, handles all that client-side routing pretty nicely. And we just want to make it look a little bit nicer. So we can give this a class name of flex items center and justify between. Awesome. So now we have the option to add the pet. If we decide to cancel, we can go ahead and go back to the home page. Okay, so we've done a pretty good job of creating pets in our database. We have made sure that this works all right and the user experience is pretty good. One thing we did not cover that I want to jump on really quick is this, what happens if we have an error. And I think what we're going to want to do is basically tell Remix to throw an error. So instead of returning, we're going to throw a new response object, and we're going to say something like not allowed for now. And in that response object, we're also going to give it an object with a status of 400. So we're basically telling the user, hey, that's not allowed. And for now, let's also go ahead and console log that error object. Okay, so we'll save that. And just to make my life easier, I'm also going to go and make this input not required. So we can actually go ahead and submit that. And then we're going to get this error bad request. So it's pretty handy that Remix handles this for us. As long as we return a response object and we give that status code, it's going to give this response page for us. Now that's not a beautiful way to handle it because we probably want to provide some sort of error object or error messaging. But we are not going to cover that right now. We're just going to leave this as a bad request in case we know that someone is doing some funny business and we just want to make sure that there's some sort of handling for that. So go back here, we can see that the error object was caught and logged, and I'm going to come back to that for now. So at least that is taken care of. So one other thing I wanted to mention when we were creating this insertion to insert this SQL query was anytime that we are executing a SQL query based on data that we are receiving from the client, we have to be extra careful that we protect ourselves against SQL injection attacks. So a SQL injection attack could be if in this data, a user actually submits not just Nugget's name, but a string of SQL that's going to be executed. So if we were passing a raw SQL string to our database, that could include or provide a vector for a SQL injection attack. Now, to prevent against SQL injection attacks, if we were doing a raw SQL string, we could use things like parameterized queries or escaping the input or using stored procedures. Unfortunately for us, because we're using an ORM, most ORMs actually protect your data against SQL injection attacks as long as you use their built-in functionality. Now, Prisma does have a way to write raw SQL, so if you are going to drop into that, just make sure that you are being extra careful when you receive data from a user and you insert it into raw SQL. In our case, we have our butts covered, so that's great. Thank you very much, Prisma. Okay, I think I'm going to stop us here for today because we covered a good amount of traction. So we covered the create part of our CRUD operations, which is super cool because now we are able to actually put data into our application. In the next video, we are going to look at the read and update operations. So if you want to be notified when that video comes out, be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you have any comments or questions or concerns about the video you just watched, throw them in the comment section below or reach out to me on Twitter. We'll try and get you sorted and get those questions answered. Hit the link in the descriptions to set up a new Linode account. We have $100 of credit that we can get for you, and we're gonna need that at the end of this series when we actually deploy the application. Cool, well, that's all I got today. I will catch you in the next video.